So we'll start with Professor Laurie Turnbull, who is a PPF Fellow and Associate Professor and also Director of the School of Public Administration at Dalhousie University. She'll discuss her Brave New Work paper and its recommendations and best practices for managing disruption across sectors. And after that, we'll hear from Dr. Sherry Scully, who is the Principal of SES Workforce Research and Consulting. And she'll share her own experience navigating disruption and helping an industry through that, through her experience in the shipbuilding industry in Nova Scotia. So please join me first in welcoming Laurie Turnbull. Laurie, over to you.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Andre. And thanks very much to the Public Policy Forum for giving me the opportunity to participate in this. This is really great. Special thanks to Andre and Heba for doing all of the organizational work. Very special thanks to Katie Feenan, who kept me on track as much as a human can keep me on track on this. So I really, really appreciate her help and everything that she did to make the paper better. I'm not going to go through the paper in great detail. Instead, I'll give you a little bit of a sense of what I was thinking when I wrote it and what the priorities were and what kind of goals we were trying to reach with it. So I'm really interested in future of work and definitely future of public service work and how we can sort of prepare ourselves as much as possible for what kind of supports we're going to need going forward. So I'm particularly interested in the conversations around, what it will look like if we unpack the capital city and we create more space for remote work and more work-life balance and allow people to get past perhaps like a place-based obstacle when it comes to working for the federal government. I'm really interested in all of those sorts of things. I'm also very interested in the processes around upskilling, reskilling, how to make workers more versatile, how to make work more enriching. And I'm really interested in how universities and other educational institutions can play a role in that. I think universities have rightly over time been accused of being very much set in their ways, not necessarily as reflexive and responsive as they need to be. And especially given the disruption that we face now, the importance of institutions, and I think the responsibility of institutions like universities really pitching in on economic resilience. I can certainly speak from the perspective of being at a large university in Atlantic Canada. I think Dalhousie has a huge role to play in rebuilding after COVID, in fortifying sectors, in giving people the skills that they need, giving opportunities for reskilling, networking, all the rest of it. And so I come to this project with a lot of personal interest in the stakes in it. So my goal with the paper was to try to get a sense of what sectors need to rebuild when they are disrupted. And I'll give you a sense of, I'm going to give you three things just to try to make a relatively lively and organized presentation and not just jump down a rabbit hole. I'm going to talk to you about three things that I think are important, and I will give you the three recommendations that came out of the paper. So when we're thinking about rebuilding, when we're thinking about sectors are about people. So the first thing that I want to say is that we did a lot of thinking about the importance of inclusive economic growth and rebuilding. This is not just, we're not just seeing this through a COVID lens, but we know that COVID provided a lens on inequity, on vulnerability. We know a lot more, I think, than we did before from the perspective of the public on who in our public is vulnerable. And we know that we have to take a strategic, deliberate approach to leadership in this area. We know that when it comes to rebuilding sectors, all sectors, we know that some have been hit much more than others by COVID-19. We know that some were vulnerable, and now we see that more clearly. And so I think we really need to put that lens of inclusion on everything we do going forward. We know that if we leave things as they are and we leave things, kind of open to their own growth and development, we know that women are far more likely to be left behind. We know that we risk losing some of the progress that we've made, a lot of the progress that we've made. We know a lot more about the social determinants of health. We know the vulnerabilities of essential workers. We know the vulnerabilities of racialized Canadians. And so I think equipped with that knowledge, we need to make sure that the investments that we make in growth going forward are inclusive. I was really impressed and struck by the speech that President Biden made at his first 100 days. And he said something that I think was actually transformative for an American president, especially in this day and age, to say there are investments that only a government can make. I cannot agree more. And I think, there's a huge role. We are at a huge moment now for a redefined state as we look to the kind of changes that we're going to make. So I'll leave that there. Number two, with respect to sectors, strong sectors mean strong workers. We need to give workers the opportunities they need for reskilling, upskilling, becoming diverse in their skill set, because we know that a kind of linear approach to I'm going to get a job when I'm 25 and I'm going to keep that and get a pension, like we're not in that world so much anymore. Some of us are, and a lot of us aren't. And so I think we need to think about what kind of a collaborative role governments, universities, other educational institutions, sectors, industries, companies, how can we all work together to set up the conditions that we need? And some of that, I think that was on the go anyway, even before we got stuck with COVID-19. I mean, people already were talking about how we could harness the benefits of remote work, flexible work, working from home. We know that would allow a more diverse and inclusive approach to recruiting workers. We know that. And so how can we embrace that, but at the same time providing the protections and supports that we need? And some of that is going to come with time. I think, we'll be doing studies 10 years from now, 20 years from now to see whether a remote worker, was promoted in the same scale and the same, time and pace as a non-remote worker. And so we'll see some of that. But I think, it's important to have eyes wide open from the get-go. Sectors can learn a lot from each other in terms of how to rebuild if disrupted. And one of the examples that came to me when I wrote the paper was actually a very personal example about the Cape Breton coal industry. I am from Cape Breton. My father was in the coal industry. I can remember when the government made the decision finally to close the coal industry in Cape Breton. And again, for many people, this would have been a decision that was a long time coming, given the billions of dollars that the government had invested in an industry that was failing. However, the lack of coordinated response to trying to make things work for the workers, for their families on a cultural level, given the importance that the industry played in life in Cape Breton across the board. Even though it was a failing industry, it was still the staple of the regional economy. And to lose that, the benefits did not seem clear in Cape Breton at all. And so I remember this sense of people just being displaced and families being lost. And this wasn't a question of a bunch of men who were about to retire. And I say men deliberately because men were coal miners and women were not. But there was a sense of just being lost. Here is your severance package, most qualified for that, but not a full pension because they weren't old enough. So you had this sort of 40s, 50s, workforce who no longer had work. And it was really, really devastating. And so, that serves as a really strong lesson for what not to do. And I think now, we have enough information to know that we need to coordinate the response for how to, resituate workers who still have, a lot of work left in them, but not an opportunity that is presenting itself. And that brings me to a third point on the importance of lifelong learning. I really think that universities and educational institutions are responding to this need. So are industries, so are companies, in the sense that there are opportunities for on-the-job learning and on-the-job reskilling so that you don't have to leave work in order to learn. I think universities and other educational institutions are helping to kind of repackage and rethink their approach to pedagogy. And they're creating, instead of focusing on degrees all the time, they're creating smaller credentials that take less time to earn, but are recognized, are certified. And I think that part is really important. In order for the skill to be recognized and transferred, it needs to be, at the level of certification that it's recognized across the board. So with those three things in the back of our minds, or the front of our minds, hopefully, the recommendations that we came up with for the paper are, number one, plan for change, plan for disruption. It should be part of an industry, a sector's planning to plan for a wind down, to understand how it will affect a community, particularly if it's something like the coal mining industry in Cape Breton, where it really kind of captivated and defined the whole place. Where was the planning there? What do you do when the industry shuts down? What do you do for the families? What do you do for the people? And so even, there's lots of thinking to do there, but essentially just be aware of the fact that there's probably no sector that's immune from disruption. We see what happened with COVID-19 and completely unexpected outcomes. And so, let's just sort of do a better job at the long-term planning. Two, it's important to take an inclusive, data-driven approach to recruitment, hiring, and education. I think we're able to do that. We have the tools to do that. Sometimes we have to be really careful. We always have to be really careful, because sometimes the approaches to data collection and data creation can have a bias in them themselves. So it's important to be inclusive in, things like STEM, making sure that women and racialized Canadians are part of that data building process. So then you see the whole process being inclusive from beginning to end. And third, and I will wrap up, it's important for us to bridge the gaps in a social safety net that assumed a certain approach to employment that no longer applies across the board or even broadly. We're seeing a rise in, there's lots of words to describe precarious work, gig work, part-time work, short-term work. We see a rise in that. And for some people, that's a positive thing, because it gives them a bit more flexibility. Some are being forced into that because of a lack of stable work. And so how are we going to rethink some of the pieces of our social safety net, knowing that? And I think being at the point that we are now, where we can see the capacity during the COVID-19 period of an empathetic state. I'm not suggesting that we just spend money like crazy for the rest of our lives, but I am suggesting that there's certainly, I think, an expectation now that government plays a role in managing the disruption of individuals' lives and sectors' lives too. So thank you very much for that. And I apologize if I spoke too long. I'm going to very happy to welcome Sherry to the virtual stage, and she's going to give you a really interesting discussion of sector renewal in Nova Scotia. So thank you.
Thank you, Laurie. So I've got about 10 minutes or so here. I'm just going to tell a bit of a story. I wrote a case study regarding disruption or surviving disruption in Canada's shipbuilding industry. And a case study really is a story that we use to illustrate a scenario. And in this case, I'm going to talk a little bit about the state of shipbuilding in Nova Scotia at the time, back in 2014, when the contracts were awarded, and some of the challenges that they encountered in trying to scale up their workforce. So back in 2014, the contracts had been awarded. It had been about a 3-year process of championing Nova Scotia and Irving Shipbuilding to be one of the contractors for that. And the hope at the time was that, well, once the contracts arrive, that the workers will simply come back. And I say come back because the industry had been in about a 20-year slump and had a long history of this sort of boom and bust, where you build the ships and then for 20 years you don't build anymore. And of course, what happens is that your best employees leave, they move on. And many of them had transitioned into other more stable, more secure industries, many of which were out on the West Coast. The assumption was that once the contracts were awarded, that they would all come back, and it would be very easy to repatriate those workers. And in fact, it wasn't easy to do so. People had established roots in other places. They really did see those other industries as being more secure, and they were more dubious about the longevity and the durability of this industry should they come back to it. So there was a real confidence gap there, which created an initial recruiting challenge, especially for the most senior or the most experienced workers. There was also a lack of awareness really about what the opportunities were in the industry and really what the shipbuilding industry meant. And again, that had a real challenge for recruitment, whether it was recruiting people from overseas, whether it was recruiting new young talent into the industry, many of whom had grown up not hearing anything about the shipbuilding industry because it had been in a bust cycle for the past 20 years. And so this lack of awareness meant that there was a real recruitment a challenge facing the industry. Additionally, the workers who did remain, they tended to be a very homogenous group of older men, which meant that the industry didn't look quite as attractive to new young talent who were accustomed to or hoping to at least enter into an industry that had a lot more diversity. And so that presented a huge challenge for them, not just from a recruitment perspective, but also from a management perspective, in terms of bringing in young workers who had very different expectations of what workplace culture would be like and what a mentoring or what a supervisory relationship would look like. And finally, there was, this shift to automation that had happened when Irving rebuilt their big assembly hall that they have now. I mean, it is state of the art, and there had been a big shift in the shipbuilding industry itself to include much more automation. A lot more digital skills were required as a result of that, and so there was a need to upskill the current workforce who were already there and were considered to be experienced, but also any of the new workers who were coming in. And it became evident very early on that the programs that existed for trades workers, they were not keeping up with those new skill sets that were required. Now, this risk of automation was somewhat limited. I know in Laura's paper, she talked a bit more about the risks of job losses due to AI. And this was less a case of job losses. It was more a case of the jobs themselves being transformed and requiring a very different skill set or a modified skill set. And again, this shifted that whole mentor-mentee relationship that you often see in a shipbuilding yard, where the mentor is the experienced one, and where suddenly we have new young talent, new young apprentices coming in who are either much more capable or much more willing to learn the digital skills that are required for that particular role. So some real management challenges were there. Of course, we ended up with a bit of a capability gap. As I said, the most experienced employees had already left and moved on to other industries, and we're not coming back, or we're coming back reluctantly. And over the years, over that 20 years, there had been a significant gap in knowledge transfer. So, the workers who were at the top they were not really in a position to kind of trickle that information down to newcomers, simply because the newcomers were not being hired because of the gap. And therefore, we ended up with quite a top-heavy workforce and not a good or not a long succession plan, and with newcomers coming up the pipeline. And also with the shift to more digital skills and to more collaborative and cognitive skill sets, there was a shift in emphasis from to brain instead of to brawn. And the new high value skill sets were less about technical skills and more about being able to solve problems collaboratively in teams, about being able to adapt and quickly pick up new technical and technological skill on the job. And again, that this whole skill experience equation that existed between mentors and mentees, it was really kind of upended and flipped over. We now required managers who had really good technical and also interpersonal skills, which wasn't always the case in an environment where Trump had always, experience had always trumped mentoring skill. And so, to summarize, what the kind of disruptions were, these disruptions, they covered everything from what was made in the yards, from how the work was being done, from the skills that were needed at all levels of employees, from who was actually doing that work, the kind of knowledge that was transferred and how we transferred it, not just down through the apprenticeship, but also up to older workers. And also the very workplace culture where now diversity and equity and experience and tenure and adaptability, all these things were all being valued, but being valued in a different way than they had been in the past. And so it became evident very early on that a much more complex and broader set of skills was needed from employees. But as I said, the current post-secondary programs were not actually delivering on those skills. And so what industry did was they partnered, and industry being Irving Shipbuilding, they partnered with a few groups, but in particular with the apprenticeship program in Nova Scotia, and also with the NSCC, the Nova Scotia Community College. And they worked to update some of their apprenticeship programs and make sure that they were working with industry so that they reflected the more current and future skill needs that they needed from those people coming out of the program at the different levels. They also brought in critical senior talent, and many of them had to be brought in from overseas because they no longer existed here in Canada. But they were brought in on a temporary basis to begin that knowledge transfer, and also to buttress the current workforce so that the workforce was ready and able to run with the projects once they did launch. And the other thing they did was they established the Irving Shipbuilding Center of Excellence, and that was in partnership with the NSCC. And this was a really interesting project. It was called Pathways to Shipbuilding, and it was based on a cohort model, which is intended to offer a point of entry for underrepresented workers who were trying to find a way into the industry, where for years and years there hadn't been that obvious point of entry, or there had been some very, very obvious obstacles to entry. And so this program, it had a trades focus initially. And I say initially because there are plans to expand the program beyond just the trades. But initially it really focused on metal trades, ironwork, welding, pipe fitting, and so on. And the cohort model meant that they focused on underrepresented cohorts who would actually go through the program together. So, for example, they've had a female cohort go through. They've had 2 Indigenous cohorts go through. I think that the second cohort is actually in the program right now. And they had a whole cohort of African Nova Scotian workers. And we've seen some real success with this program. There's different ways to measure success in these types of programs, whether it's registrations or how many people apply to the program. But 2 of the best indicators of success of programs like this is actually the post-graduation hiring rate, which in this case was 89%. So those who made it through the program, they were not guaranteed a job. They were guaranteed an interview though. And they did have an 89% post-graduation hiring rate, which is unseen in many programs that are similar to this. But in addition to that, it's one thing to hire people into the program, but are they getting the supports? Has the workplace culture changed and adapted enough to keep them? And for that information, we look to retention rates. And actually, of those individuals who were hired into employment, they found a 95% retention rate a year later, which is a really good sign that many of those social supports are in place. I say a year later because that's not enough time has passed for us to see what the retention rates are beyond that, though I suspect there'll be ongoing research into that. In terms of going forward, what I'd like to see, great support we're seeing from the post-secondary institutions, with adapting to future skill needs and adapting in the moment. I personally would love to see more support also from the secondary schools, and delivering youth with some of those high demand, cognitive skills and collaborative skills, so that they are entering post-secondary programs with those already being key parts of what they do, and how they think about the world, and also the expectations that they have for equity and diversity in a workplace. Thank you.
Thank you so much for getting the conversation started for us, Sherry. Those are some fascinating insights from the shipbuilding industry in Nova Scotia. So thank you so much. I'd like to invite Lori back to join us on the stage now, Lori, and I want to open the floor up to questions from the audience. So just a reminder, you can submit your questions in either language through the Q&A function, and I'll put them to our panelists for you. So first up, right off the bat, we've got a great question from the audience here about supporting sectors that, like you said, Lori, maybe haven't planned for, haven't done succession planning or haven't kind of planned for transformation, but in some cases, there might be benefits to that industry transforming. And so the example that the audience member gave is oil and gas or other industries that might have a climate impact. That are looking to change. Is there a way, do you have any kind of insights or ideas about how the government can sort of support them in that transformation that is maybe a transformation for the better?
Yeah, I mean, so I think that governments can certainly provide incentives for green transformations. That's something that the government has to, and not the government, federal and provincial need to take that as a kind of a long-term goal and a long-term investment. I think the other thing that struck me is I jumped over to the chat function actually, and I looked at that question. I started thinking about it, and I thought universities have a role to play in that as well, because I think we're seeing in other educational institutions as well, we tend to silo off disciplines, right? In that you go to university and you get a degree in government, or you get a degree in business, and the other two, and lots of other things, but the two don't overlap as well. And I think what we are seeing, especially when it comes to industries disrupted and need to kind of grow, right? Like even if your industry isn't totally disrupted, even if it's still doing well, but it needs to change. I think it would be advantageous to everyone if those in the business sector understood more about government, what government needs, what regulations require, and then at the same time, government understood more about what challenges businesses are facing. And so I do think there's a role for the educational world in helping to create those conversations from the get-go. But I also think that's a long process kind of thing that involves investment from the government, that involves the government taking a share of risk, so that businesses are able to do the things they need to do to transform without it seeming like just too much,
Right.
impossible. Yep.
Yeah, really appreciate that. That's something that I really appreciated about your paper in general, is the idea, like you said earlier, strong sectors mean strong employees, strong workers. The fact that this is not just about industrial policy, it's about education, it's about social policy, it's about all of these different pieces. So I'm glad that you brought that in here as well. We've got a couple other questions from the audience, but I had a quick question for Sherry, just building off of something you said during your presentation. It reminded me of a question that was posed during the conference yesterday to Jerry Diaz, and unfortunately he didn't have a chance to answer it. So now I'm putting you on the spot about it. But you mentioned that the transition, from skill sets that privilege brawn now to skill sets that privilege brain. And that made me think of the question that was about, well, who's getting left behind in that transition? And what does it mean for workers who maybe haven't, don't have the high skill sets that are going to be in demand in the future? And how do we kind of make sure that everybody is brought along for that transition?
Well, that's that right there. That's the question of the hour, right? Like, how do we do that? I think here's one example where if you wanted to play, you had to really adapt. You simply had to. There wasn't a choice. I think the programs that were developed were put in place to help older, tenured, experienced workers to catch on, to adapt. Some jobs and roles were restructured. Some of them required, the balance of technical skill over kind of digital skill still worked in their favor enough that they could slowly catch on. That's not always the case in every industry. Sometimes, one skill is supplanted by another so quickly that there's not the time to adapt, and that becomes really difficult. But that's where I think that whole mindset of lifelong learning, I mean, this is a concept people have been talking about for years, but it's no longer just sort of, oh, it's just my mantra in life. I believe in lifelong learning. I mean, this is like the philosophy or the mindset that you need to have going forward. I've written papers on this as well, commenting that we need to really get out of this mindset of just front loading all your education and then saying you're launched and now go. That in many ways that whole apprenticeship model is one that kind of works for everything, even for professional roles. Where we have some, then we work and we have a place to anchor that learning in, and then we have some more. And that breeds a much more adaptable worker, a much more resilient worker, someone who can venture off in different directions based on, their skill set, but then also their interest, but also based on serendipity. This is where we build a much more resilient workforce by providing these opportunities to build on accreditation. And also it also helps us to adapt more to the needs of industry in a much more kind of bespoke and timely way.
Right. I really appreciate that. Laurie, I saw you nodding vigorously through that. Did you have anything you wanted to add?
I just really like Sherry's points. And when we think about how, that approach to lifelong learning, like it is just a completely different approach to you get all of the things you need, when in the 4 to 10 years, after high school, and then you're kind of launched and set for life, right? It doesn't work that way, but that's no fun either, right? Like, even if it did work from a professional perspective, from an economic perspective, like who cares? Who wants to do that? Like, it's much, much more interesting to be able to come back and diversify the things that you know about, and to be able to network with new people. And I don't think, I think But at the same time, the universities and the educational institutions have a role to play in making that possible and rethinking the reality of the learner.
I appreciate that. So a couple more great questions here from you, is switching gears just a little bit. One of the questions we've got is about nationalizing workforces, and this audience member in particular, Leo, thanks for your question. He says, you know, the federal government is doing this. They're nationalizing their workforce. People are able to do a job from anywhere, and that's having all kinds of impacts on the workforce. And he wonders, you know, are provincial governments or smaller organizations maybe doing this, considering this same approach? And in particular, what is that going to mean for the labor market in general? Could it have some unintended consequences? For instance, he talks about that the housing market may be changing, or where people are geographically placed. What do you think about that, Laurie?
That's a great question. Yeah, I think if we can get to the point where we can overcome place-based obstacles to applying for jobs and doing the work you want to do, I think that's extremely important. It's important for recruiting and retaining a really strong workforces. It's important for the satisfaction of the worker, the work-life balance of the worker. It's really important to making sure that our workforces are diverse and inclusive. Like, all of those goals are, I think, top of mind and should be. And so changing our approach to, you know, hiring in the sense that we're getting around, you know, the pool for this job has to be local. No, like we can actually go quite a bit beyond that. And then that will increase people's interest in applying for positions that they probably never would have thought they would have had a chance to do before. Will there be unintended consequences? Absolutely. And I think we just need to be mindful of those things, right? Like it's like anything else. Like, if we think about the example of unpacking the capital and taking a lot of federal government jobs and moving them around. Okay, housing markets have to be able to absorb that. I hope this is going to bring fantastic opportunities for Nova Scotia. Broadband has to be able to absorb that, because right now, like even in Nova Scotia, like we're seeing things like remote work, telehealth. Those opportunities are extremely important for quality of life in Nova Scotia. They are also hindered by the fact that a lot of communities don't have awesome access to broadband. And I did a cohort last week. I was really fortunate to do a few days with a cohort in Nunavut. They are grappling with, you know, broadband access and all of the ways that they, you know, the challenges that they're facing would be completely transformed if we were able to solve that issue. They also have a critical housing crisis. So like a lot of these issues, I think, really go hand in hand. And if we start moving around the workforce, we are unlocking a bunch of policy challenges at once, which is great, but it could be overwhelming. I could keep going, but I'm gonna stop.
No, I really appreciate that. You know, the idea of overcoming some of these obstacles as part of a forward-looking workforce strategy is so important, and it feeds into the next question, probably the last question from the audience, because we're already running out of time here. But it's about, you know, how do we make the most of the opportunities that transformation presents in order to build a more inclusive workforce and to overcome some of these obstacles, like the ones you just mentioned, Laurie. You know, taking into account that the kinds of opportunities that things like work from home are not going to be available or accessible to everyone. I'm thinking about, you know, Sherry and the workers that you work with in the shipbuilding industry, where it's a very place-based job by its nature. And so how do we, you know, as we kind of embrace some of these changes and transformations, how do we make sure that we're doing that in an equitable way and bringing everybody along for the ride? I don't know if maybe both of you want to comment a little bit on that.
Sherry, I've been talking too much. I'm happy to be quiet.
Yeah, I mean, that's a tricky one when you are working in place-based employment. But you know, one of the things that is happening is, you know, an awareness that that there's a need to be flexible for different people and their different life stages and where they are. You know, if you want to have women in the workplace, then you need to be a bit more accommodating to, you know, pickup times and drop off times and things like that, that you need to have some built-in flexibility to make it easy for women to stay employed. And that, you know, that's just one example. it's very tricky in the place-based, and this is where we've seen, sort of people gravitating towards careers where they do have that opportunity for a bit more flexibility. And that's also why, any of the research studies where you look at women in these careers and you see them lean out between sort of 30 and 45, they lean out for exactly those reasons, because they are lacking that flexibility. So I think it's one of those things that needs to be on employers' minds, that if you value women in the workplace, if you value people from different communities in the workplace, then you need to understand what the barriers are that interfere with that type of commitment.
Yeah, and those kinds of considerations need to be tied into any kind of succession planning, so that when there is a transformation or a disruption in a given sector, that all of those folks are able to come along for the ride as the workplaces evolve. Laurie, I'm going to give the last comment to you. What do you make of the drive to make sure that industries going through transformation are taking advantage of the opportunity to be as inclusive and diverse as possible?
Yeah, I mean, I like listening to Sherry's comments. I was thinking too, like, it's important for employers and government and educational institutions to see the strategic choice and responsibility around ensuring that their workplaces and the opportunities that they're giving are equitable. It is a strategic choice to ensure that women are present throughout your organization. It is a strategic choice to make sure that it is inclusive and that it is equitable. And like it's just something that we all just it's there. Like, let's do it.
Yeah.
And so, and I think there's a lot of opportunities for collaboration on that too. Like, no one can succeed in that on their own. It has to be the universities, the educational institutions, the government, the companies. Like, we all kind of have to see the role that we play in that. I think it's really important, frankly, to listen to the experience of workers and employees, and not focus. And this might sound like a contradiction to what I said before. I'm focusing on data-driven, evidence-based. Like, know what you're doing, know the science, know where your performance indicators are, and at the same time, listen to people's stories, because the data will not give you all of it. You need to still listen to people's stories about their workplace experience. Are they happy? Why or why not? You're telling them they have flexible work. Do they feel that it's flexible work? Are they are they maintaining a good work-life balance? So we need a lot of feedback that's not necessarily captured in numbers, but just opportunities to talk and build those trust relationships.
Yeah, amazing. I hate to cut this conversation short, but that's all the time we've got for today. I think this conversation went in a direction that many of us didn't expect, because we went into it thinking about industrial policy and how to kind of protect and empower industries who are experiencing transformation. And I think what we've really heard is how important it is to think of this holistically. Think of sectors and economies going through transformation as part of an ecosystem that also includes things like social policy and education policy, et cetera. One of the things that I would love to see is, we ended on this note of the importance of inclusion and the strategic importance of it. I'd love to see some research on whether that makes industries and sectors actually more resilient to transformation and disruption, is that kind of inclusivity. Anyway, well, I'll have to leave it there. I want to thank you, Laurie and Sherry, so much for sharing both your expertise and your research, but also your personal experience and stories really helped bring it to life today. So thank you so much.
Thanks, Andre.
Thank you.